You know the drill, smash that like button until it gives up. And hit subscribe because trust me, we're just getting warmed up here. Things are about to get juicy. Ed observed the exchange quietly, noting that Julius's opposition to harsher punishment had likely influenced the lighter sentence. Still, this outcome played into his hands. Being barred from this year's awakening ceremony was a significant dishonor, especially for someone representing Rose Palace. It would give Camellia Palace ample opportunity to overshadow Rose Palace. Once the plan was in motion, Ed believed Theo would be powerless to stop it. If Theo tried to appeal, Ed thought they could always resort to eliminating him. However, he doubted Theo would be that foolish. To everyone's shock, Theo broke the silence. "I want to appeal," he announced, his voice unwavering. The dragons in the room were visibly stunned. Ed's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "This fool is playing right into our hands," he thought. Julius's concern was evident as he addressed Theo. "Do you understand what appealing truly means?" he asked. "I do," Theo replied confidently. He was well aware that the 3-month probation was a lenient slap on the wrist, most likely orchestrated by Julius. However, Theo had no intention of accepting even this minor punishment. In the proud and powerful Ragnar clan, appealing was tantamount to declaring war. Theo's voice rang out across the courtroom. "In the end, only the victor can speak the truth," he declared. "And I intend to be rewarded, not punished." As he spoke, the system notified him that he had entered the main scenario. The dragons were left speechless at his audacity. The system message continued, informing Theo that this scenario would reveal secrets buried deep within the Ragnar clan, encouraging him to succeed. His first scenario quest was titled The Successor's Path. Elsewhere, chaos had erupted at the hidden northern branch of the series' Merchant Guild. The building was ablaze, and a cloaked figure expertly cut down the last of the guild members. As the final blow fell, the figure turned. It was Evelyn. Remington approached her, holding a small chest in his hands. "Just as Theo predicted," he said with a smirk. "Camellia Palace, under the Trovian name, is finished." Back in the courtroom, Ed, unaware of the destruction unfolding elsewhere, remained confident, thinking that their plans were progressing without a hitch. Once the room calmed, Wolfgang spoke again, incredulous. "You would escalate this issue into a full-blown war over a mere probation sentence?" he scoffed. "Your arrogance knows no bounds. Do you truly believe you can stand alone against the combined forces of the 15 clans?" Theo met Wolfgang's gaze steadily. "I understand the odds," he said. "But in cases where there is a vast power imbalance, it is common to resolve appeals through proxy battles, is it not?" Julius's eyes narrowed as he listened. In the Ragnar clan, an appeal usually resulted in an outright war, but when the disparity in power was too great, a proxy battle was used. Each side would choose a representative to duel in their place. Naturally, Theo would represent the defendant, while it was almost certain that action would be chosen for the plaintiff. If that happened, Theo's defeat seemed all but inevitable. Julius wondered if Theo had some hidden strategy or was simply counting on either himself or Evelyn to step forward as his champion. If so, Theo would be sorely disappointed. Theo's voice broke the silence. "Let us proceed according to the rules," he said. "We will each choose a representative, and the proxy battle will be held in 1 week." He glanced around the room. "How does the council feel about this suggestion?" Ed, calculating rapidly, believed Theo was indeed banking on either Julius or Evelyn fighting on his behalf. But both were unlikely to intervene, forcing Theo to face action on his own. Ed was about to voice his agreement with Theo's proposal and announce action as the representative when a familiar voice interrupted him. The entire room froze as the courtroom doors swung open. Kyle Ragnar, the clan head, strode in, his presence commanding the attention of everyone present. "You've become quite adept at these schemes, haven't you, Theo?" he remarked, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "My son," he continued, addressing Theo directly, "you have changed a great deal since we last met." Immediately, the dragons in the room bowed deeply, paying their respects to the clan head. Theo followed suit, lowering himself to the ground as he greeted his father. "Apprentice swordsman Theo Ragnar at your service," he said, his voice filled with respect. "I greet the incarnation of the great dragon god." At that moment, the system provided an update for Theo. His first scenario quest had officially begun. The Path of the Successor. The objective was to seize control of Camellia Palace and uncover its secrets. Theo's mind raced as he recalled the blue light he had seen earlier. He had been too preoccupied with recent events to investigate further, but it was clear that something crucial awaited him there. For now, however, he had to focus on the present. Theo peered up at his father, realizing that Kyle's unexpected arrival had thrown a dangerous and unpredictable element into the mix. His carefully laid plans could be upended at any moment. Why had his father come? Kyle ordered Theo to rise, which he did without hesitation. The clan head spoke, his tone measured. I happened to hear about the situation on my way to the tribunal. It seems you found yourself in quite the predicament. He paused, his gaze piercing. I understand you wish to resolve the matter through an appeal via proxy battle? Theo confirmed with a nod. That is correct, he said. Kyle studied his son closely. If you intend to proceed with a proxy battle, you must realize that it would be unwise for you to fight personally. His eyes narrowed as he posed the critical question. Who do you intend to choose as your proxy? Ed, sensing the high stakes of this moment, watched closely, his alarm growing. Theo's answer here could alter the course of everything. But Theo wasn't just spitting lines. He knew the so-called proxy battle was just a diversion, bait for the bigger play. His real strategy, the proof of Camellia Palace's treason that he'd tasked Evelyn and Remington with uncovering. That would win the day no need to fight. Still, it felt good to say exactly what was on his mind. But then, things took a hard left. Kyle, his eyes glinting, told Theo he wanted to offer him a personal opportunity. He wasn't just talking anymore. The room went silent when Kyle announced that he, the Master of Ragnar, wanted to test Theo personally. One strike. If Theo could survive one blow from Kyle, the clan head himself, all charges against Theo would be dropped. Everyone in the room froze, including Theo, who was left standing there, trying to process the sudden change in the script. Kyle didn't wait for Theo to answer. He turned on his heel, barking for Theo to follow him outside for the test. But before Theo could even take a step, Ed, his ever-scheming adversary, exploded into action. Wait, Ed shouted, desperate to intervene. He knew damn well that Kyle acknowledging Theo as a worthy opponent was a game-changer. If Theo survived this hell, if he even stood his ground, it would mean the clan head himself saw potential in him. Ed's mind raced. There was no way Theo could handle Kyle's strike, but if he did, everything would change. Ed wasn't about to let that happen. Vassals and bannermen can't judge the bloodline of the clan head's son, he argued, clinging to formality. He pushed for the proxy battle, hoping to keep things under control. But Kyle wasn't having it. Sky Dragon, Kyle barked, eyes flashing. Shut up. His voice was enough to freeze the blood in Ed's veins. If a vassal speaks like that, get rid of them. Ed was forced to swallow his pride and muttered a reluctant agreement. Kyle turned to Julius, who was stifling laughter. You got something to say? Kyle demanded. Julius, still grinning, shrugged it off. Nah. It's just been a while since you've taken this much interest in something. Kyle waved him off. But the air had shifted. The room was tense, charged. Kyle turned back to Theo. Well? He asked, eyes locked on his son. How about my suggestion? Will you accept? Theo, still processing, felt his plan crumble before him. But he wasn't rattled. If anything, he welcomed the chaos. Smiling, he played along. It's a bit heavy, don't you think? He replied, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. A single strike from the clan head is no light thing, especially compared to a proxy war. Kyle raised a brow. So you're not accepting? Theo quickly clarified. Oh, I'll accept, but the stakes should be adjusted. Kyle's interest peaked. Adjusted how? Theo grinned. Let's make it worth my while. Something like Camellia Palace. The room went dead quiet, as if Theo had just slapped every soul in there. Ed's face twisted in fury. That brat, he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Wolfgang thought Theo had lost his damn mind. A deal? With the clan head? It was madness. Theo had no place making such bold demands. But Kyle, to everyone's shock, agreed. You want to be a successor? Kyle said, turning to face Theo. Then you'll need that kind of boldness. He shot a look at Ed, daring him to object. Ed, biting back his rage, could only mutter, Everything belongs to you, my lord. Satisfied, Kyle turned to his council and barked orders to prepare the stage for Theo's trial. Soon enough, they were standing on the stage. On one side stood Kyle and the dragon heads. On the other, Theo, ready to face the impossible. Ed seethed internally. His carefully laid trap had backfired, turning into a platform that could elevate Theo instead. But still, Ed reassured himself, there's no way Theo will survive a single strike from Kyle. His imagination ran wild with images of Theo crushed, humiliated, and, better yet, dead. Theo knew what Ed was thinking. Hell, he was counting on it. But Theo had a secret weapon, the tutorial reward. A gift that would make all the difference. Kyle, ever the sharp-eyed master, noticed something was off. Did you consume an elixir? Kyle asked, eyes narrowing. He could sense the change in Theo, though no one else seemed to pick up on it. Still, Kyle shrugged it off. Doesn't matter, he said with a smirk. Theo's still my flesh and blood. Kyle stepped forward, asking Theo if he was ready. Theo, Evercool, nodded. I'm ready, he said. Kyle, amused, told Theo that he'd forgo his usual greatsword. After all, Theo didn't know how to use mana yet. Instead, Kyle grabbed a rusty steel sword, something that wouldn't obliterate Theo in a single swing. The other dragon heads, all in agreement, nodded. Of course not, they said. And then it began. Kyle released his aura, and the sheer pressure of it hit Theo like a wall. Theo could barely stand under the force, his body trembling, his knees buckling. Kyle was impressed. You're still standing, he said, raising his sword. Theo grinned through the strain, knowing that his strength stat had nearly tripled thanks to the elixir he received for clearing the tutorial. His level had jumped by 7, and his strength now sat at a solid 52. Kyle lifted the sword, and the world seemed to slow. Every eye was on them. Kyle swung, and the ground exploded under the force of his blow. The air filled with dust and debris as the stage shattered beneath Theo's feet. But when the smoke cleared, Kyle's eyes widened in shock. Theo had blocked the strike. Kyle stepped back, impressed. It's been a long time since I found a son worth keeping, he said, walking away with a smirk. But before Theo could breathe, his sword cracked, shattering to pieces as he collapsed, spent. Ed and Wolfgang stood frozen in disbelief. Julius and OSA, meanwhile, looked on, relieved. Kyle turned to the crowd and announced that Theo had proven his innocence through sheer will. The trial was over. At that moment, the system appeared before Theo, congratulating him for completing the sudden quest. Single strike of Kyle Ragnar. His reward? Inventory authority and the elusive blue key. Theo lay there, exhausted but victorious. His plan had worked, but the path forward was only just beginning. As Theo's vision slowly adjusted to the light streaming in, he saw his mother's tear-streaked face hovering over him. Her expression was a mixture of relief and worry, and he could feel the weight of her concern. "Mother," he whispered, his voice still hoarse from exhaustion. "I'm okay." Cecilia, unable to hold back her emotions, embraced him tightly. "You foolish boy," she cried, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea how terrified I was? When I heard you had faced the clan head's sword, I thought I had lost you." Her arms gripped him as if she could shield him from the world. "Where even are we?" Right on cue, Julia strolled in, dropping news like it was no big deal. By order of the clan head, the former lady of Camellia Palace, Amel, and her little buddies, Action and the director of intelligence, Ed, have been kicked out. Theo blinked, floored. "Wait, does that mean I passed?" Julius flashed a proud grin, confirming it. "Yep, and right now, you're in Camellia Palace." The system chimed in again, letting Theo know the scenario had been updated. He'd completed the Camellia Palace mission. Only one thing left: uncover its secret. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Amel was throwing the tantrum of the century. She stomped around like a kid who didn't get her way, screeching about losing what she thought was hers. Her servant tried, and failed, to get her to chill, but Amel wasn't having it. Inside, Ed was boiling over, practically vibrating with rage as he called Action. His voice cold, he ordered, "Kill Theo Ragnar." Action, in his usual laid-back way, shrugged it off. "Relax. I was already planning to take his arm during the awakening ceremony." But that wasn't enough for Ed. "Take his head instead," he growled, barely holding it together. Noticing how pissed his uncle was, Action realized the situation had just gone from no big deal to, oh crap. Back in the palace, Theo was deep in thought. Things had played out way differently than he'd expected, but he couldn't complain. He'd gotten control of Camellia Palace without even using his ace in the hole. Bonus? He'd snagged a second authority, the inventory. Curious, he opened it up and reached inside, pulling out an apple. As he took a bite, he strolled around, still kind of blown away by the whole store stuff in thin air deal. He didn't fully get how it worked, but he knew it was going to come in handy. Reaching in again, he pulled out a blue key. It was labeled as a miscellaneous item with a dungeon opening tag. He glanced over at the room that had been glowing blue earlier and connected the dots. The key and the room were linked. Sliding the key into the lock, he wasn't shocked when it fit perfectly. But when the door swung open, what did surprise him was finding a hidden cave behind it. The system popped up, announcing that he discovered a dungeon for the first time, and that all experience earned inside would be doubled. Theo was floored. Who knew a cave had been stashed inside Camellia Palace? This had to be linked to some kind of quest. Not wanting to miss out on the sweet double XP, he took a step forward. Then paused. Yeah, going in empty-handed? Not smart. A moment later, fully loaded with a ridiculous number of swords in his inventory, Theo headed into the dungeon armed with a sword and shield. As he ventured deeper, he heard something. His eyes widened as a massive white wolf appeared before him. The wolf didn't waste any time, it lunged straight at him. Luckily, Theo's reflexes kicked in, and he blocked the beast's jaws with his shield. Pretty strong, he muttered under his breath before slicing at the wolf's side. He wasn't about to let the wolf think it could outmuscle him. But the wolf was fast. It let go of his shield and jumped back, dodging his strike by a hair. The beast snarled, baring its fangs before leaping at him again. Theo didn't back down, he charged right at it, swinging his sword, but the wolf barely flinched, kept coming, relentless. Theo gritted his teeth, bracing with his shield, realizing just how tough this thing really was. It was fast, way too fast. Theo knew his regular attacks weren't gonna cut it. This isn't some ordinary wolf, he thought, his mind racing back to the tales of demonic beasts from the Demon Sea, way beyond the northern wall. This thing could be just as powerful, maybe even worse. The wolf swiped at him with razor-sharp claws, but Theo ducked, barely dodging it. He charged forward, mind flashing to that brilliant ray of light he'd seen when his father executed the single strike. Kyle's attack was flawless, an arc of pure white energy that seemed to split the air itself. Theo raised his sword, trying to imitate the move, and swung down at the wolf, but it dodged easily, just tilting its head like it was nothing. The wolf leaped back, and Theo cursed under his breath. Pulling off that strike was going to be tougher than he thought. He realized then that the single strike wasn't just about swinging hard, it was about pouring everything into one perfect blow that guaranteed death in a single shot. That's the key, he thought, shifting focus. He decided to ditch his shield and go all in on his sword skills and the speed techniques Evelyn had drilled into him. He leapt high into the air, catching the wolf totally off guard. It looked around, confused, just as Theo came crashing down, driving his sword straight into its skull. The wolf howled in pain, blood pouring from its eye as Theo yanked his sword free. He grinned finally, a hit that counted. The wolf, now blind in one eye, growled furiously, but Theo wasn't worried anymore. He knew he had this. With confidence, he dashed toward the injured beast, ready to end the fight for good. 2 months later, at training ground number 4, Ood looked around, noticing more and more people crowding the area. "We might need to move this," Sybil said, nodding at the swelling crowd. Ever since rumors spread that Kyle Ragnar had taught Theo the single strike, people had been coming from all over, eager to test themselves against him. While they were talking, Henry Morris from Plum Blossom Palace swaggered over, sneering. "So, when's your incredible young master gonna show up? It's been 2 months. He chuckled, throwing shade. Maybe Theo's run off now that his big victory stories made the rounds too much. Maybe the whole thing's been exaggerated. Huh? No witnesses at the trial. No proof of his fight with the Scaled Dragon Society. Before Henry could finish, Sybil's fist connected with his face, sending him flying. One of Henry's lackeys started yelling, but shut up real quick when he noticed the knight's glaring daggers at him. Seething, Sybil spat insults at Henry and his crew. "You're nothing compared to Theo." Ood tried to ease the tension with a joke about Sybil's temper, but Sybil, still fuming, wasn't having it. He didn't care about jokes. He was done letting these idiots disrespect their young master. "Draw your swords," Sybil shouted, and his comrades followed suit. The Knights of Plum Blossom Palace did the same, ready for a full-on clash. But before the battle could go nuclear, a figure with long blue hair suddenly appeared, freezing the swords of both sides. The crowd gasped. Everyone recognized Frost Sword Ray Ragnar, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. A moment later, loud laughter echoed across the training ground as another figure made his entrance. Hulkus Lank, aka Black Bear, another of the 4 Hounds, stepped onto the scene. The knights were shook. 2 of the 4 Hounds here? Hulkus, though, looked unimpressed by the crowd. "Where's Theo?" he asked, calling him by his nickname Luster Tiger. "I'm here to challenge him personally." Meanwhile, deep inside Camellia Palace's dungeon, Theo sat, utterly drained. Sweat dripped down his face as he clutched his half-broken sword. The system wouldn't stop notifying him that he'd leveled up again. He'd been tearing through demonic beasts non-stop, and the tally now stood at 170 down, 1 left. Only 1 beast remained out of 171. Theo leaned against the dead wolf's body, catching his breath. Suddenly, a loud growl echoed from nearby. His status window popped up, showing his current stats. Level 15. Strength, 91. Vitality, 20. Intelligence, 19. Dexterity, 25. Magic power, 198. Luck, 6. Unknown stats, 2. Allocatable stats, 0. Theo pulled a potion from his inventory and downed it in one gulp. Within seconds, his wounds healed, and he felt his strength surge back. He knew he'd come way too close to death more times than he'd like to admit in that dungeon. But those beginner healing potions, restoring a measly 10% of his health, had saved his hide again and again. As he glanced around at the pile of demonic beast bodies he'd left in his wake, Theo couldn't help but think about how brutal those early fights had been. But as he leveled up, the grind got easier. Time had slipped by 2 whole months in this hellhole, and now, only one beast remained. He knew what that meant. The boss fight was up next. Theo ascended the stairs to the 5th floor, where the final challenge waited. He paused, noticing his sword was toast, completely wrecked from the last battle. With a sigh, he tossed the broken blade aside and pulled another from his inventory, a ceremonial sword his mom had given him on his birthday. He looked it over, remembering how he'd dismissed it in his past life, barely even glancing at it. Back then, there'd been tension between him and his mom before the awakening ceremony, and like an idiot, he'd thrown the sword aside, letting it rust. Now, though, he took a moment to really look at it. White snow steel, rare and powerful. He let the memory of that day wash over him. Cecilia had barged into his room, grinning like a kid, wishing him a happy birthday as servants trailed behind her, arms full of gifts. She'd waited until midnight just to surprise him. But in his frustration, Theo had snapped, shouting that with the awakening ceremony coming up, he didn't have time for birthdays or presents. He'd coldly thrown in her face that no amount of shiny gear could change someone's bloodline, leaving her speechless and hurt. Theo regretted that more than anything now, and in this life, he swore he wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. He tightened his grip on the sword and kept moving toward the boss room. The system chimed in, warning him to brace for a strong demonic beast. Stepping into the chamber, his breath hitched. Massive claws, a long tail, and a mouth that could tear through steel. It was a dragon. Or no, just a lesser drake, thankfully. Theo sighed, how relieved. It wasn't a full dragon, but still, this was no pushover. He remembered the legends of his Ragnar clan, descendants of dragons, or so the stories said. Seeing the drake now, it all felt too on the nose to be a coincidence. But whatever it meant, one thing was crystal clear. He had to beat the drake to finish this dungeon. The system flashed the last objective of the scenario quest. This was it, the final demonic beast. Theo steadied his breath, gearing up for the battle ahead. Could he really take down a drake? Even a lesser one was still part dragon. He squared his stance and decided to go for the single flash technique. He'd honed that move on the dire wolves in this dungeon. Sure, it wasn't on the same level as his father's dragon flash, but if Theo tapped into his dragon heart, he could definitely land a serious blow. Sword at the ready, he charged forward, focusing his energy. The drake stirred, sensing the danger, but Theo was quicker. With precision, he unleashed the single flash, driving his sword into one of the drake's eyes. Blood gushed from the wound. His plan was working. The drake swung its massive tail at him, but Theo dodged just in time, narrowly avoiding getting crushed. He'd hoped to hit the brain, but he hadn't quite reached that far. Still, he could see the potential. The drake snarled, its rage tangible. Theo gripped his sword tighter and launched himself at it again, activating Jester's footwork. He danced around the drake with blinding speed, slashing as he moved. For a split second, Theo thought he might actually win this. He set up for another strike, planning to distract the drake with a quick hit before going for a weak spot. But before he could follow through, the drake let out a bone-chilling scream. The system flared a warning. Fear ability activated, and Theo's body froze. His movements slowed by 10%. The drake's fiery gaze locked onto him, paralyzing him. He couldn't move. Then the drake's claws came crashing down, and though Theo tried to block with his sword, the sheer power sent him flying into the cave wall. He hit hard, blood dripping from his forehead. This wasn't just a boss fight, this was a nightmare. And if he didn't end it soon, things were about to get a whole lot worse. Gritting his teeth, Theo pushed through the pain and charged once more, locking eyes with the beast. As it lunged at him, he spotted the reverse scale on its neck. That was the weak point. As the drake's jaws came down, Theo ducked at full speed and rammed his sword into the exposed scale with everything he had. The blade sank deep into the drake's neck, stopping it cold. But Theo wasn't done. He shoved the sword in even deeper, causing the drake to scream in agony. For a moment, he smiled. His plan had worked. But the drake wasn't finished. Now fully enraged, it glared at him with a primal fury and roared once again. Theo's heart raced, panic setting in. Meanwhile, back at training ground number 4, the tension was thick enough to cut with a sword. Sybil and the knights stood frozen. Hulkus, clearly pissed off, demanded an explanation from Ray. Where's Theo Ragnar? He needs to face me first. Ray, completely unbothered, shrugged him off. Losers should stay out of it, he said, which only made Hulkus' anger boil over. Hulkus fired back, his face flushed with frustration. 3 years have passed since our last duel, Ray. I've improved enough to close the gap. But Ray just shrugged, still calling him a loser, and that was all it took for Hulkus to snap. Red with rage, he lunged at her, roaring that they should settle it again, right here and now, to see who deserved to face Theon. His massive sword swung at her, but Ray, completely unbothered, blocked it without even breaking a sweat or moving a muscle. Sybil, looking totally confused by this sudden showdown, muttered, "What the hell is happening?" Henry, still nursing the punch Sybil had clocked him with earlier, whispered, "I don't know, but I'm terrified." Before the tension exploded any further, Remington appeared out of nowhere, slipping between Ray and Hulkus and using his sword to stop their clash cold. "If you two want to brawl, take it somewhere else," Remington warned, his voice low. "You're not causing trouble in Theo's domain while he's away." Hulkus, not fazed at all, greeted Remington with a cheerful grin, like they were old friends. "Remington, I've been wanting to duel you too." Remington's patience was wearing thin. "Did you not hear what I just said?" But before he could finish his thought, something dark, something powerful, hit them all like a ton of bricks. Everyone in the training ground felt it, a wave of overwhelming, suffocating force. Remington whipped around, trying to pinpoint the source of the killing intent. His eyes went wide when he realized it was coming from none other than Theo, slowly approaching, his presence heavier than ever. What happened to him during these 2 months? Remington thought, trying to make sense of the suffocating pressure Theo was radiating. Ray, meanwhile, just stood there watching quietly. Hulkus, on the other hand, grinned wide, almost thrilled at the sight of Theo. He was eager for this confrontation. Theo carried the power of the Lesser Drake now, a force that dominated the battlefield. Moments earlier, deep in the dungeon, the Drake had locked eyes with Theo, its anger flaring with one final roar. Theo had braced himself, expecting the beast to strike again, but instead, the Drake collapsed, dead. The system congratulated him for slaying the Lesser Drake as Theo pulled his sword from the reverse scale. He lay down on the Drake's body, exhausted, reflecting on just how close he'd come to losing. When the Drake had thrashed wildly after he hit its weak point, Theo was convinced it was over, but it had worn itself out. The system flashed his rewards: Lesser Drake's tooth and claw. He glanced at the descriptions. The tooth could be used to strengthen a weapon's durability, and the claw could enhance a weapon's sharpness. Theo looked at his worn-out sword, thinking it was time to give his mother's gift a little upgrade. Another notification popped up. He had gained the Lesser Drake's Fear skill, rank D with 1% mastery. It granted him the ability to release draconic killing intent, overwhelming weaker targets. Theo was stunned. Dragon killing intent wasn't something just anyone could get. It was a power for the elite. While he wasn't sure how useful it'd be in a place full of powerhouses like Ragnar, he knew this was a game changer. Storing the Drake's tooth, claw, and his sword in his inventory, Theo left the boss room. The system confirmed he'd cleared the Camellia Palace dungeon. As he stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over him. Quest complete. The system congratulated him once again, presenting his reward for clearing scenario quest number 1. A nest compass. Theo examined the strange item. The compass supposedly guided its holder to a nest, but he wasn't sure what that meant. Shrugging, he stashed it in his inventory for later. Right now, all he wanted was rest. Every step toward his room felt heavier than the last, exhaustion weighing him down. Suddenly, a maid came sprinting toward him, yelling something urgent. Theo groaned. "Can I not get a break?" But he turned to face her. The maid, wide-eyed and shocked at his bloody, disheveled state, stammered, "Where have you been?" Theo waved her off. "It's nothing. What's going on?" Panic crossed her face. "There's a brawl at training ground number 4. Theo sighed, frustration rising. Of course there is. When Theo arrived at the training ground, his irritation was obvious. Without hesitation, he activated his new fear skill, unleashing a wave of draconic killing intent. The weaker ones dropped like flies, collapsing under the weight of his power. Hulkus, on the other hand, beamed, clearly impressed. "Now we're talking," he laughed, charging at Theo with excitement, swinging his massive sword. Theo, completely unfazed, deflected Hulkus' attack with one swift upward swing, sending Hulkus flying back like he weighed nothing. The sheer power of Theo's counter left everyone including Remington and Ray in stunned silence. Hulkus, stumbling back to his feet, couldn't believe how easily his strike had been repelled. Still shaking off the impact, Hulkus growled, "No way am I taking that." He was furious now. Black Bear, as Hulkus Lank was often called, had always been considered one of the weaker of the four hounds of the North. He hadn't fully developed his skills and, frankly, wasn't the brightest bulb in the pack either. Hulkus roared as he swung his massive sword down at Theo, daring him to block it. Theo braced himself, fully aware that, as a member of the Lank clan, Hulkus had never been outmatched in sheer strength. But when the swords clashed, Theo deflected Hulkus' blade by slamming his own sword down, countering with his single flash technique and slicing Hulkus clean. A proud smirk crossed Theo's face as it hit him. He had just parried Hulkus' brute force and even managed to counter. Yeah, all that leveling up? Totally worth it. Hulkus coughed up blood, his body splattered with it, before he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Theo sighed, realizing he'd accidentally used his full strength in that swing, but felt relieved. Good thing it was Hulkus Lank, the human tank, Theo thought. That meant Hulkus had only fainted. Sybil stood there, mouth open, stunned. But then he started cheering, and soon the rest of Theo's followers joined in, chanting their young master's name. Theo defeated the Black Bear. He took down one of the four hounds with a single strike. The cheering didn't stop, even as Theo awkwardly tried to explain that Hulkus was still very much alive. Just then, Theo's sword cracked, and half of it fell to the ground. Panic hit him, his mother's birthday gift, destroyed. But before he could say anything, Sybil hollered in admiration. "Of course! Only you could break a sword with a single strike." Theo scowled. "Why are you so happy about this?" he snapped. Meanwhile, off in the distance, Remington and Ray watched in silence. Ray's gaze lingered on Theo, her mind flashing back to a childhood memory. She remembered a time when he had found her walking in the cold and asked, "Who are you? Why are you out here freezing?" He draped his scarf around her shoulders and asked if that helped, then commented, "You still look cold." Smiling warmly, he'd taken her hand and led her to his house, promising to keep her safe until the snow stopped. As Ray recalled that moment, a soft smile spread across her face. Then, without saying a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Remington speechless. Had Ray Ragnar just smiled? Back at the palace, Theo found himself in a bizarre situation. He sat there at the celebration, blushing under the weight of a ridiculous hat, as the maids excitedly congratulated him on his new title luster tiger. They gushed about how hard he'd worked, telling him to keep it up until the awakening ceremony. His mother, Cecilia, appeared, proudly placing a giant bowl of food on the table. "My son," she beamed, as she began shoveling large portions onto his plate. "Try this. It's abalone." Theo tried to stop her, but she kept going, practically force-feeding him, insisting he try the meat from chickens raised only on acorns from the western Laxaria desert. He wanted to protest, but when he saw the look on her face, the sadness hit him like a wave. In his past life, he had seen her corpse. That memory crept in, making his voice softer as he told her the food was delicious. He smiled, appreciating her love, even if it came with an overabundance of food. Later, when the feast was over, Theo showed his mother the broken sword. Cecilia froze, stuttering as she took it from him. "What happened?" she asked, shocked. Theo, nervous and full from all that food, explained that the sword had broken during training. Apologetically, he added that it was the precious gift she'd given him for his birthday. To his surprise, Cecilia cursed loudly, something Theo wasn't expecting. "That old hag!" she shouted, making him look at her in confusion. She swore up and down that the sword, made from white snow steel and ebony steel wood, would never break. Theo blinked. "Wait, ebony steel wood? You mean the stuff from the Gaia jungle?" Cecilia nodded, her anger growing. "That's right. The old woman said it was made from only the rarest and most precious materials." But Theo knew ebony steel wood was no joke. It was a strange plant that fed on iron, giving it the flexibility of wood but the strength of steel. The sword was high quality, alright, but he hadn't realized it was that valuable. Now he wondered where his mother had even gotten such a rare sword. Cecilia, still fuming, declared, "This won't do. I'm confronting that old woman and demanding a replacement. She's gonna make a sword worthy of you or else." Theo, a bit overwhelmed, tried to calm her down. "Mom, it's fine. I'll just use another sword." But Cecilia wasn't having it. "No way. People are starting to recognize your true worth, and we need to make sure everything is perfect, especially with the awakening ceremony just days away. I won't let you walk in there with a broken, shabby sword. Theo sighed, smiling at her determination. She was impossible to argue with. Now that we're on the subject, Cecilia continued, turning toward the door. Let's go right now. Theo grabbed the broken sword from the table and asked, Where are we going? She turned back, grinning confidently. To the best workshop in all of Wintora, the Basque Workshop. The Basque Workshop, one of the 3 biggest weapon manufacturing centers in Wintora, wasn't just massive like a factory. It had a reputation for producing the finest weapons. Theo couldn't help but feel a bit curious. The most jaw-dropping thing about the Basque Workshop wasn't its size, but its Master A legend in their world. Classified as special rank by the intelligence agency, this blacksmith held the elite title of Master Craftsman, a distinction shared by only 2 other artisans in the Ragnar family. But that's not all. This figure also carried some terrifying nicknames. The Elf of Capitalism Incarnate and the Demon Craftsman, Curson. Theo's mind was spinning. He was about to meet that Curson? A living legend? He couldn't wrap his head around how his mother knew the Demon Craftsman. But before he could ask, Cecilia casually asked Curson if she was still smoking and wait for it, called Curson her mother. Theo's brain almost short-circuited. His mother? The daughter of the Demon Craftsman? What? Curson wasn't having it. She shot back immediately, rejecting the mother title, reminding Cecilia that their relationship had ended the day she ran away. Theo was floored. He had always believed his mother was an orphan with no family ties. Now here he was learning that Curson, a freaking high elf, was his grandmother. A quarter elf. That explained a lot about his striking looks. Curson, turning to Cecilia, asked why their dear customer had shown up after never visiting before. Cecilia, without skipping a beat, tossed the broken sword toward Curson and said she was returning a defective product. Curson caught the sword, her irritation obvious. Defective? She growled, clearly offended. How dare Cecilia call one of her forged blades defective? But that irritation quickly turned to shock as Curson inspected the destroyed weapon. Cecilia, completely unbothered, pressed her. So, if it's not defective, then what is it? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, Theo stood off to the side, still grappling with the whole quarter elf bombshell. Curson, after a beat, asked who had wielded the sword. Cecilia, without hesitation, pointed to her son. Curson's eyes flicked to Theo, her expression sharp. Him? That boy behind you. Cecilia swiftly corrected her. Watch your words. That's no boy, that's Theo. A genius who will one day rule over Ragnar. Her voice was full of pride, and Theo felt a mix of embarrassment and determination under her glowing praise. Theo stepped forward, bowing respectfully. It's an honor to meet you, master of the Basque Workshop. I'm Theo. Curson, still fixated on the broken sword in her hands, nodded. I've heard of you, she muttered, her tone softer. Then, with a sideways glance at Cecilia, she added, You've raised him well. If you want to know what happens next, you know the drill. Smash that like button and subscribe. Comment Daffy because trust me, you don't want to miss the next part.